She stood on that platform in the worst heat of a Texas summer, her hands folded in front of her so no one could see them shaking, 18 years old, every coin her family owed, written in chalk on a board above her head. The auctioneer called her name like she was livestock. If this story of a woman who refused to break moves something in you, please subscribe to our channel and follow along to the very end. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. The chalk on the board above Nora Whitmore's head read $47.12. That was the sum total of what her father had borrowed from 3 different men over the course of 2 years. Money for seed money for medicine, when her mother took sick money for the burial when the medicine didn't work. $47.12, and the men who held those debts had grown tired of waiting. So on the 3rd Saturday of July, in the town square of Harlow Creek, Texas, they sold the debt collector's solution standing upright on a wooden platform in the full force of noon sun. They sold Nora. She kept her chin up. That was the only decision she had any control over. And she made it deliberately, consciously, the way you make a decision you know you'll have to remake every 30 seconds for as long as it takes. Her dress was pale blue once before 100 washings had pulled most of the color out of it. Her hair was dark and pinned back tight. She was not small, she never had been, and she stood with the full weight of herself planted on that platform, like she intended to be difficult to move. The auctioneer, a man named Dobbins, with a red face and a voice built for livestock sales, was reading from a paper. Female age, 18. Strong constitution, capable of domestic work, cooking, laundering, child-minding. She cook well, someone called from the crowd. Her daddy's ledger says she kept house since she was 12. Her daddy's ledger, another voice answered, and there was laughter. Nora did not look at the crowd. She looked at a fixed point just above the heads of the men gathered in the square. Maybe 30 of them. A few women lingering at the edges with the particular expression people wear when they want to be horrified but cannot quite bring themselves to leave. This was legal. That was the thing that sat in the center of her chest like a stone. Not everywhere, not in all circumstances, but here under the debt collection ordinance that Harlow Creek had carried on its books since before the war, a creditor could petition the county to recover debt through indentured labor. Her father had signed something. She was not entirely sure what. He had been drinking the night the men came to the house with their papers, and by the time Nora understood what she was reading, the ink was already dry. Her father was gone now. Moved on 2 weeks after signing, headed west, sent no word. Dobbins cleared his throat. Starting price reflects the outstanding debt. Who'll open at $47? Silence. Then a man near the back, fat, prosperous-looking with a gold watch chain that caught the sun, said, 20. The debt is 47. 20 for a girl that size, take it or leave it. More laughter. Nora felt it go into her like something physical, like a hand pressed flat against her sternum pushing. She kept her chin up. 25. Someone else offered. Mostly it seemed to see what would happen. I got 25. Do I hear 30, Bo? 26, the fat man said, and laughed at his own joke. She was going to be sold for $26 to a man who thought cruelty was wit, and she was going to have to go with him because there was no one left to stop it. That was when the voice came from the side of the square. $60. It landed in the crowd the way a stone lands in still water, a clean, solid sound, and then ripples moving outward in every direction. Heads turned. Nora turned. He was standing slightly apart from the main body of the crowd, which was the first thing she noticed, not in it, not quite of it. Tall. Lean in the way of men who work rather than men who starve. A dark canvas vest over a collarless shirt, with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and a hat pulled low enough that the shadow crossed the bridge of his nose. He had not shaved in several days. He was looking at the platform with an expression that was hard to read. Not angry, not indifferent, not particularly warm. Something more like a man who has looked at a problem and worked out the arithmetic and is not enjoying the answer, but is going to commit to it anyway. $60, Dobbins repeated, and even his auctioneer's rhythm had stuttered. That's sir, You understand the term's indentured service period to be negotiated. I understand the terms, the man said. $60. I'll go 65, the fat man said, turning to look at the stranger with an expression that had stopped being amused. The stranger's gaze moved to him, held there for a moment. Something in that look made the fat man's smile go uncertain around the edges. 80? The stranger said. The fat man opened his mouth, closed it. $80, Dobbins said, and he sounded almost nervous. Do I hear 90? Nothing. 80 going once, 80 going twice. A pause that felt to Nora like it lasted considerably longer than it was. Sold. Sir, if you'll come to the table to sign. The stranger was already moving. Nora watched him cross the square. He had a particular walk, unhurried, but direct the walk of a man who has decided where he's going and sees no reason to rush, and equally no reason to deviate. When he reached the table beside the platform, Dobbins pushed a paper toward him, and he read it, actually read it top to bottom, which no one had expected him to do based on the way Dobbins' expression shifted while he waited. This says 12 months, the stranger said. Standard term for the debt amount, yes, sir. Cut it to 9. Sir, the creditors have specified. The creditors got their money. I'll pay the full 80, which is nearly double the outstanding debt. The term is 9 months. He looked up from the paper. Or I walk and you can explain to Mr. Hargreaves, he glanced at the fat man who had moved closer, why his winning bid was $26. Dobbins looked at Hargreaves. Hargreaves looked at the stranger with the particular expression of a man recalculating. Then Hargreaves shrugged one shoulder and turned away, and Dobbins dipped his pen. The stranger signed. Dobbins countersigned. The whole transaction took 4 minutes. Then the stranger turned for the first time to look directly at Nora. Ma'am, he said, my name is Ethan Calloway. I've got a ranch about 9 miles north. I have 2 children, twins 6 years old, and I need someone to help run the house. He paused. I won't pretend that's not a job. It's a hard one. But you'll have your own room 3 meals a day, and I won't ask anything of you that isn't on that paper. He nodded toward the document Dobbins was blotting dry. I'm sorry this is how it happened. Are you able to travel today? Nora had been holding herself so still for so long that the simple directness of his words, the absence of performance in them, no mockery, no ownership in his voice, loosened something she had not known she was bracing. Yes, she said. Her voice came out level. She was grateful for that. All right. He turned to where a wagon was hitched at the side of the square. Whenever you're ready. She climbed down from the platform without help, because he didn't offer it, and she didn't ask. And she thought stepping down onto the packed dirt of Harlow Creek Square, for what she suspected was the last time that there was something to be said for a man who assumed she could manage her own 2 feet. They didn't talk much on the road north. Ethan Calloway drove with both hands loose on the reins and his eyes forward, and Nora sat on the bench beside him, with her small canvas bag in her lap. Everything she owned, which was not a great deal, and watched the scrubland roll past in the summer heat. After maybe 2 miles, she said, Why? He didn't look at her. Why what? $80 is a lot of money. It is. You don't know me. I know you didn't deserve what was happening to you. She sat with that. You could have hired any woman in town. Could have, he agreed. But any woman in town would have been hired. Not. He paused, appeared to choose a word, and then not quite use it. The situation you were in, that needed addressing. You make a habit of addressing situations. He glanced at her sidelong, and she got the impression that she had surprised him slightly, and that he was not entirely displeased by it. Not especially, he said. She looked back at the road. The sun was tremendous and relentless, and the scrubgrass on either side was the pale, tired yellow of a summer that had taken everything it was going to take. She thought about her father. She thought about her mother's grave back outside Harlow Creek, with its wooden marker that would rot in 10 years and leave no trace. She thought about $47.12, and the fat man's laugh. I'll work hard, she said. Whatever's on that paper. "I know you will," Ethan said. It wasn't flattery. It sounded more like a fact he'd already settled on. "You don't know that either." "No," he admitted. "But I've got a good eye for it." A beat. "Usually." She almost said something to that. Didn't. The wagon rolled on. She heard the twins before she saw them. There were two voices coming from somewhere behind the ranch house, not crying, not distress, but the particular loud and argumentative tone of children who are deeply invested in some private disagreement. As the wagon came to a stop in front of the house, a small figure appeared around the corner, then a second, and they skidded to a stop in the dust and stared at her. They were 6 years old, and they looked like their father. Around the eyes, the same direct assessing quality, the same sense of computing rather than simply looking. The girl had her hair loose and wild in the heat. The boy had a scrape on his knee that had been bleeding and was now just dirty. "Who's that?" the girl said. "Lizzie." Ethan said, "This is Miss Whitmore. She's going to be staying with us and helping with the house." Lizzie's eyes moved over Nora with the frank curiosity that 6-year-olds deploy without self-consciousness. "She's big," she said. "Lizzie." "I'm just saying." Nora climbed down from the wagon and crouched not easily but deliberately, bringing herself to eye level. "You're right," she said. "I am. Comes in handy when I need to reach things on high shelves. You, Lizzie, or Sam?" The girl blinked, apparently recalibrating. "Lizzie?" "Then you're Sam," Nora said to the boy. He nodded, eyes still wide, still measuring. "I'm Nora," she said. "I don't expect you to call me anything until you know me better. That's fair, I think." Lizzie looked at her brother. Some silent communication passed between them, with the efficiency of children who have spent 6 years sharing a world mostly with each other. "Our mama's gone," Sam said. Not cruel, just informational, the way children sometimes report facts that adults have learned to treat as fragile. "I heard," Nora said quietly. "I'm sorry about that." "She died in winter," he said. "Last one." "I know." She held his gaze. "I lost my mama too not so long ago. It doesn't get smaller, but you get bigger. Eventually you can carry it better." Sam looked at her. Something in his face had gone still, the way things go still when they're actually listening, instead of just waiting for the other person to stop talking. "Does it hurt less?" Lizzie asked. "Different," Nora said honestly. "Not less. Different." Lizzie considered this with the solemnity of a judge weighing evidence. Then she held out her hand. "You can come see the kitchen," she said. "Sam broke a jar last week, but we cleaned it up mostly." Nora took her hand and stood. "Mostly," she repeated. "There might still be a little glass near the stove." "I'll watch my feet." The kitchen was rough but workable. A cast-iron stove that had clearly been maintained with some care, a dry sink shelving that needed straightening, a table scarred by years of use. Nora moved through it slowly, opening and closing things, getting a sense of the inventory, and the twins trailed her like two small boat wakes watching. "Can you make biscuits?" Sam asked. "I can." "Our last housekeeper couldn't make biscuits. She made something she called biscuits, but they were wrong." "How were they wrong?" He scrunched his face with the effort of precise description. "Heavy and sad." Nora pressed her lips together. "Heavy and sad biscuits. That's not something I'll inflict on you." "Papa can't cook either," Lizzie offered. "I heard that," Ethan said from the doorway. "It's true," Lizzie said without apology. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching. Not supervising something different from that. Watching the way you watch something that is settling into place in a way you didn't entirely expect. "The previous woman stayed 2 weeks," he said, and his tone was neutral, informational, clearly addressed to Nora. "Before her 3 weeks." "What happened with them?" A pause. "Lizzie." Nora looked at Lizzie. Lizzie's expression achieved something that was technically innocent. "They weren't the right fit," she said. "What does not the right fit look like?" "Well," Lizzie said, and then stopped. "She put a frog in Mrs. Beaker's shoe." Sam said helpfully. It was a small frog, Lizzie said, and told Mrs. Crane that the barn was haunted and she shouldn't go in there alone at night. The barn makes noises. You made the noises, Lizzie. Nora looked at Lizzie for a long moment. Lizzie looked back at her with considerable composure. I see, Nora said. Are you going to leave? Lizzie asked. There was something very careful underneath the bluntness, the kind of careful that only forms after enough leavings. Not over a frog, Nora said, and not over barn noises. She turned back to the shelves. You try something like that with me, though, and I'll know. I grew up on a farm. I know every trick in the book, and about 12 that weren't in any book. We clear on that. A beat of silence. Yes, ma'am, Sam said. Lizzie was quiet a second longer. Yes, ma'am, she said, and it came out sounding like the beginning of something rather than the end of it. But that first night after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Ethan Calloway sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him and the accounts ledger open to a page he wasn't reading, and Nora came in from checking that the back door was latched. She stopped when she saw he was still up. Sorry, she said. I didn't mean to intrude. You're not intruding. It's your kitchen too, 9 months. He nodded at the opposite bench. Sit if you want. She considered it for a moment, then sat. They like you, he said. He said it looking at the ledger, not at her. It's been 8 hours. Lizzie doesn't take to people in 8 hours. His voice had a note in it that was almost wonder, almost bewilderment, the tone of a man reporting something he has seen that does not fit his existing understanding of the world. She doesn't take to people in 8 weeks usually. She's been... He stopped, picked up the coffee cup, set it down. It's been a hard year. She told me about her mother. He was quiet for a moment. She tell you how? No, I didn't ask. He nodded. Something eased in his face. Fever, in February. It went fast. I'm sorry. It was... He stopped again. Started over. I don't need sympathy, Miss Whitmore. I'm not telling you for that reason. I'm telling you because it explains some things about how this house runs, or doesn't run, or... He passed a hand over the back of his neck. The accounts are fine. The cattle are fine. The children are Lizzie and Sam are fine. They're strong kids. But I am not... He looked up then, for the first time, directly at her. I am not managing the household piece of it well. I'll be straight with you about that. Nora looked at him across the table. This was a man who had ridden into a town square that morning and paid $80 to keep a girl he'd never met from being sold like equipment. He was looking at her now with that same quality she'd noticed in the square, not performing, not angling, just leveling. Then it's a good thing you hired someone, she said. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, something that lived in the same neighborhood. I reckon so, he said. Good night, Miss Whitmore. Good night, Mr. Calloway. She went to her room, small clean, with a window that faced east, so the morning sun would wake her, which suited her fine. And she sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a while, not sleeping, just sitting. She was 18 years old. She had been sold on a platform in a public square that morning for the price of a good mule. She had her own room. She had a locked door. She had a window with morning light coming. She had 2 children who might put a frog in her shoe, and a man at the kitchen table who'd gone quiet over a ledger and said it explained some things like someone working very hard to be fair. Nora Whitmore lay back on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and thought, all right, this is what you have. This is the territory. Work it. She was asleep before the thought finished. The first week was a study in calibration. She woke before the household every morning started. The stove had coffee ready when Ethan came through on his way to the barn. He didn't say much in the mornings, she gathered that fairly quickly, but he took the coffee and nodded, and that she understood was significant. The twins were a different equation entirely. They were not bad children. They were not even difficult children. Not truly, they were children who had been left largely to structure their own days for the better part of a year, while their father ran a ranch on grief and coffee and sheer stubbornness, and they had developed their own systems and their own rules and their own tests, and those tests were thorough. On the second day, she found her apron hidden in the water barrel. She fished it out, hung it to dry, and said nothing. On the third day, she came in from the garden to find that someone had rearranged the contents of every jar and tin in the kitchen spices, where the flour should be salt, in the sugar tin flour, in the spice jars. She put it all back without comment, baked biscuits, and served them at supper. They were not heavy. They were not sad. Sam ate 3 of them. After supper, she found Lizzie in the yard and crouched down next to her. "You're testing me," she said. Lizzie did not deny it. "How'd you know?" "Because I would have done the same thing." She looked out at the scrubland. "And worse." Lizzie glanced at her. "Worse how?" "I once convinced a woman we had a ghost in our root cellar for 6 weeks, Nora said. She never went in there alone again. I had to do all the cellar work myself, which was the point, but I didn't fully think through the consequences." Lizzie stared at her. "You did that on purpose. I was 10, and I thought it was very clever." She paused. "It wasn't. It was mean, and it made her scared, and I was ashamed of it later." She looked at Lizzie directly. "I'm not going to leave because you put my apron in the water barrel, but I'm asking you not to because it wastes my time and yours, and I'd rather spend that time doing something more interesting." She stood. "Tomorrow morning, if you want, I'll show you how to make proper biscuits. Not as a trick, just because you might like knowing." Lizzie was quiet for a long moment. "Sam would want to learn too," she finally said. "That's fine." Another pause. "Okay." She almost walked away. Then, "Miss Nora." Nora turned. Lizzie's small face was doing something complicated, all the tests running at once, all the conclusions arriving simultaneously. "Are you going to stay?" she asked. "Even if it's hard." Nora looked at her for a moment. Thought about the platform, the chalkboard, the morning light through her east-facing window. "I'm not a person who leaves when things get hard," she said. "I've never had the luxury of it." Something shifted in Lizzie's face, recognition maybe, or something older than recognition. Something that lives in children who have also learned too young that the world does not rearrange itself for your comfort. "Okay," Lizzie said again, and this time it meant something entirely different. Ethan saw some of it without being told. He was a man who paid attention to his children the way some men pay attention to weather. Not always in a way that showed on his face, but consistently, and with the knowledge that he was dependent on what he was watching. He noticed that the sabotages stopped. He noticed that Sam started voluntarily setting the table before Nora asked. He noticed that Lizzie, who had been sleeping poorly since February, started sleeping through the night again in the 3rd week of July, and he could not explain it except that something in the house had shifted. He said none of this to Nora. She was not the kind of person he thought who needed it said. She would have known already. She was watching his children with the same quiet attention he watched them with, from the same slight remove, and drawing her own conclusions and acting on them with a precision that made him uncomfortable in a way he did not yet have language for. On a Thursday evening at the end of the 1st week, he came into the kitchen late after a fence problem on the south pasture that had taken most of the afternoon, and found her at the table with a lamp and a book, and both children asleep in the adjoining room, with the door propped half open. He stopped in the doorway. She looked up from the book. Read his face, or some portion of it. "They're fine," she said quietly. Sam had a bad dream around 8. He settled. He was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," he said. It came out rougher than he intended, carrying more than he'd meant to put in it. She looked back at her book, gave him the dignity of the dark, and not looking at him while he got himself sorted. "Good night, Mr. Calloway," she said. "Good night, Miss Whitmore." He went to his room and sat in the dark for a while, the way she had on the first night, not sleeping, just sitting. He thought about the auction square. He thought about the chalkboard. He thought about $80 and whether it had been the right call, and decided for the 47th time since that morning 3 weeks ago that it had been the only call, and the only reason he'd needed was the look on her face up on that platform. Not fear, not shame, but fury. The controlled interior kind. The kind that says, I will survive this, and I will remember it, and I will not forgive it. Not because forgiveness is wrong, but because this should not require forgiveness. He had seen that kind of fury before he thought. He saw it in his mirror every morning. He closed the ledger he'd been pretending to work on and turned down the lamp. Down the hall, both children slept. In the kitchen, the lamp burned a little longer. The lamp in the kitchen burned a little longer that night, and the next, and the one after that. It became a pattern Nora hadn't planned. She would get the children down, clean up the supper things, and then sit with her book in the quiet while the rest of the house settled. It wasn't loneliness exactly. It was more like she needed to account for the day before she could release it. And the kitchen, with its cast iron smell, and its scarred table, and the low sound of summer insects outside the screen, had started to feel like the kind of place that could hold a person's thinking without asking anything back. Ethan came through most nights. Sometimes he said nothing at all, just poured himself a cup of whatever was left in the pot and stood at the window a while before heading to bed. Sometimes he said a few words, weather fence line, whether the south pasture would need rotating before August. Practical things, the language of the ranch. She answered in kind. She was not there to push past the walls he'd built. She was there to keep his children fed and his house running, and she did both with the methodical attention of a woman who had been managing difficult situations since she was old enough to carry a bucket. But the second week brought something she hadn't calculated for. It was a Tuesday just past midday when Lizzie came running into the kitchen with her face white and her voice doing something it didn't usually do, climbing unsteady, stripped of its usual deliberate composure. Miss Nora. Sam fell. Nora was off the bench before the sentence finished. Where? The old fence by the creek. He was climbing and the post gave way. He's not crying. The not crying was the part that moved her legs faster. She found Sam in the dry creek bed sitting very still with his right arm cradled against his chest and his face the color of old paper. He looked up at her when she came down the bank and said with tremendous seriousness, I think something's wrong with my arm. Let me see. She crouched next to him, ran careful hands along the forearm watching his face. He flinched hard at the wrist but didn't pull away. It's not the bone, she said. I think it's the joint. You landed on your hand. Tried to catch myself. That was smart, and it was also the wrong instinct, but we can talk about that later. She shifted to look at him directly. It's going to hurt when I help you up. You ready? Yes, ma'am. She got him up the bank with Lizzie holding her other hand as counterweight, and she walked both children back to the house with Sam's arm against her side, and Lizzie pressed close on her other flank, not saying a word, which was how Nora understood that Lizzie was genuinely frightened. The talking stopped when the fear got large enough. She had Sam's wrist wrapped and elevated, and packed with what cool she could manage by the time she heard the wagon in the yard. Ethan came through the door with the particular alertness of a man who has been told something is wrong, but not yet what, and his eyes went to Sam first, then to Nora. He's all right, she said immediately. Sprained wrist not broken. I've wrapped it. He should see a doctor in town to be certain, but he's not in danger. She watched the thing move through his face, the fear coming in, and then finding nowhere to land, and then receding in a way that looked almost like it hurt more going out than it had coming in. He crossed the room and crouched in front of Sam the same way she had. Put both hands on the boy's face, just holding it. I'm okay, Papa, Sam said, and sounded for the first time slightly uncertain about it. I know you are. Ethan's voice was rough. I know. Lizzie, standing at Nora's elbow, slipped her hand into Nora's without looking up. Nora held it. She did not look at Ethan Calloway's face, because it was not her face to look at, and because some moments belong entirely to the people they're happening to, and a good woman knows when to be present and when to be invisible, and knows the difference. Ethan took Sam into town that afternoon. Nora stayed with Lizzie, who was quieter than usual through supper, and ate mechanically, and asked twice if Sam was going to be completely fine. Completely, Nora said both times. I've seen worse from a hard handshake. Lizzie almost smiled at that. That's not true. No, but it helped a little, didn't it? This time she did smile small and reluctant. A little. After the dishes were done, Lizzie appeared in the doorway with a hairbrush and the particular posture of someone who wants to ask for something but is not entirely sure of the protocol. Nora held out her hand. Lizzie crossed the kitchen and gave her the brush and then sat on the bench in front of her, and Nora worked through the tangles in Lizzie's hair with the slow, patient attention she'd used for everything else in this house, without rushing, without yanking, finding the knots and working through them rather than past them. Lizzie was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Mama used to do this." "I know," Nora said. She didn't know knot specifically, but she knew the shape of it. She had a way she'd braid it, 3 strands, but she'd add pieces as she went. It would last 3 days before it came out. A pause. "I don't remember exactly how she did it." "I know that one," Nora said. "Want me to show you?" Lizzie went still. "You know it. My mama taught me. It's a particular braid. Takes about 10 minutes to do right." She kept working, smoothing. "I can show you slowly, step by step, so you remember." Lizzie didn't answer for a moment. When she did, her voice was different, smaller, more careful. "Could you do it now?" "Yes," Nora said. "I can do it now." She braided Lizzie's hair by lamplight while the summer dark came down outside, and she talked through every step the way her own mother had done, out loud, patient, treating a 6-year-old like she was capable of learning a real thing and remembering it. Lizzie asked 3 clarifying questions. She was going to be formidably competent at something Nora thought someday, and the world was not entirely ready for it. By the time they finished, Lizzie had twisted around to look at her with an expression Nora hadn't seen on her face before. "Will you do it again tomorrow?" she asked. "If you want. And teach me properly all the steps." "All the steps. You'll have it in a week." Lizzie nodded, satisfied. Then she said almost offhandedly, with the studied casualness of someone hiding the weight of a question, "Miss Nora, do you think you'll want to stay? After the 9 months?" The kitchen was very quiet. Nora set the brush down. Thought about that, the question, and what was underneath it. The 6-year-old's particular mathematics of loss, and the way it reconfigures every arrival into a potential departure. "I think," she said slowly, "that 9 months is a long time, and a lot can happen in 9 months. And I don't want to make you a promise I don't know yet if I can keep." She looked at Lizzie directly. "But I can tell you that right now, today in this kitchen, I don't want to be anywhere else. That's true. I'll give you that." Lizzie looked at her for a long moment. "That's more than the other ones said," she said finally. "The other ones weren't telling you what they actually thought." "How do you know?" "Because I'm telling you what I actually think, and you can hear the difference." Lizzie held her gaze for another second, and then nodded once, with the decisive finality of a judge issuing a ruling. "Okay," she said. "Okay." She went to bed, and Nora sat in the kitchen with the lamp and thought about 9 months and what happens after, and couldn't make it land anywhere solid, so she let it go for the night. Ethan came back with Sam around 9. The wrist was a bad sprain. The doctor had said no break, rest and time. Sam was drowsy from the trip and the anxiety of the day, and Ethan carried him to bed without waking him and came out to the kitchen where Nora was still up. He stood at the stove a moment with his back to her. She waited. "Thank you," he said, "for getting to him fast, for knowing what you were looking at. I grew up on a farm. You learned to triage. Still." He turned around. His face was tired, bone-tired, the kind of tired that isn't about the hours in the day, but about the cumulative weight of being the only responsible adult in a situation for a very long time. The doctor said if the joint had been moved wrong on the way in, it could have been worse. "I've wrapped a lot of sprains," she said. "My brother used to fall off everything." He looked at her. "You have a brother." "Had. He died at 14. Fever." She said it evenly, not to minimize it, just because it was true, and she'd lived with its truth long enough that she could carry it without bracing. Different from yours. He was sick for a long time first. Ethan was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry. We collect our losses, she said. That's just how it goes. He looked at the table. Then he sat down across from her, first time he'd done it voluntarily, without her already being there, and he folded both hands around the coffee cup and stared at them. Clara, he said. That was it, just the name. He said it like a man saying a word he doesn't let himself say often enough. Your wife, Nora said quietly. She ran this house like it was breathing, like every part of it was alive. She knew where everything was. She knew what the children needed before they asked. She could walk into a room and know what was wrong with it and fix it in 10 minutes. He stopped. I'm not saying this to make you feel... I know you're not, she said. He looked up. The children... He stopped again, started over. Lizzie stopped talking much after. Sam stopped sleeping. I was keeping everything moving, but I wasn't seeing it right. I was looking at the cattle numbers and the fence lines and the water levels, and I wasn't... He shook his head. You were grieving, Nora said. It was not an excuse, and it was not a judgment, and it came out as neither. I didn't have time. That's what I said, she said. You were grieving. He was quiet for a long moment. Then very quietly he said, She would have liked you. Nora felt something move through her that she didn't immediately have a name for. She didn't try to name it. She just held it there for a moment, and then set it down carefully and said, I hope so. The lamp burned between them. Outside, the summer night made its sounds insects, and the distant small movement of cattle, and the occasional dry breath of wind. After a while, Ethan said, I'm going to check the barn. All right. He stood, started for the door, then stopped with one hand on the frame. Miss Whitmore. Yes. You're doing well here. He said it to the doorframe rather than to her. Better than well. I want to say that. She looked at his back. The careful, slightly rigid set of his shoulders. The posture of a man who is not accustomed to saying things like that, and is not entirely sure it was the right call. Thank you, Mr. Calloway, she said. He nodded once and went out to the barn. The third week of July arrived with heat that was no longer summer, but something more personal, more aggressive, the kind of heat that comes looking for you. It found the ranch in the early morning and stayed through dark, and everyone moved differently in it, with more economy, less conversation, the particular efficiency of people who are managing their own comfort as a practical problem. It was in that heat that Nora first met the town. Ethan needed supplies and couldn't leave the ranch. The south pasture fence had given in 2 more places, and the cattle were testing the remaining sections, so he asked Nora to take the wagon into Harlow Creek. She went. She was aware going in of what it would be. She was not naive. She had grown up in Harlow Creek, and she had been sold in its square 3 weeks prior, and the people who had watched that had not gone anywhere. The mercantile was run by a woman named Mrs. Aldgate, narrow, precise, with the expression of a woman who does not believe in softening what she thinks. She looked at Nora over the counter for a moment when Nora came in. Miss Whitmore, she said, perfectly neutral. Mrs. Aldgate, I've got a list from Mr. Calloway's ranch. I heard you'd gone out there. She took the list, read it. You're working as the housekeeper. Yes, ma'am. Just the housekeeper. Nora looked at her steadily. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Aldgate held her gaze for a moment, then looked back at the list and began pulling items. You were raised better than this, she said, not unkindly exactly, but with the specific tone of someone who thinks they are being direct on behalf of the other person's benefit. I was raised to work, Nora said. That's what I'm doing. People talk. People talk about everything. She kept her voice level. Was there anything on that list you can't fill? A pause. Then Mrs. Aldgate set the list on the counter. You know what they're saying about you and Calloway. I can guess. Does it bother you? What bothers me, Nora said quietly, is that I was standing on a platform 3 weeks ago while 30 people watched and maybe 5 of them found it uncomfortable. What people say about me now bothers me considerably less than that." Mrs. Aldgate was silent for a moment. Then she said, "The flower's in the back. I'll get it myself." And she went, and there was something slightly different in the set of her shoulders on the way. It wasn't approval exactly, but it wasn't nothing. Outside, though, was less complicated. There were 2 women by the water trough, wives of men whose names Nora knew, women who had watched the auction from the edges and left before the end. One of them said clearly, and for Nora to hear, bold as anything coming to town like that. Nora was loading the wagon, and she did not stop loading. "Wonder what exactly she's keeping house for," the second woman said, and they both laughed. Nora set the last bag in the wagon, tied it off, and turned around. Both women were looking at her the particular look of people who have said a thing expecting it to land without response. "I cook," Nora said. "I clean. I'm raising 2 children who lost their mother in February and whose father is running a ranch alone. I'm doing it for 9 months because I didn't have another option, and I'm doing it well. You're welcome to inspect the account if you'd like to verify." She picked up the reins. "Enjoy your afternoon." She drove out of Harlow Creek without looking back. By the time she cleared the edge of town, her hands were shaking slightly, but they steadied by the time she hit the first mile of open road, and she let the heat and the scrub grass and the long, empty horizon do the work of absorbing it, the way landscape does when you let it. When she got back, Ethan was at the fence with the wire stretcher, and Sam, wrist still wrapped arm in a sling, was sitting on the fence post, watching and offering opinions. Lizzie was in the garden doing something complicated with a stick, and a spider she appeared to be studying. Nora unloaded the supplies. She did not mention the town, but at supper Sam said, "Papa Hank Dobbs said his mama said Miss Nora came into town today and told Mrs. Pierce and Mrs. Hull something that made their faces go like—" He pulled a face that appeared to be attempting outrage and failing at comedy like that. Ethan looked at Nora. Nora put a biscuit on Sam's plate. "Eat." "What did you say?" Lizzie asked. "The truth," Nora said, in a moderate tone of voice. Ethan was still looking at her. She met his eyes for exactly 1 second before she went back to serving supper, and in that second, she saw something in his face that she didn't catalog or name, just noted and filed away. "Good," he said, quietly, just the one word. She served the rest of the meal. The twins argued about something that had happened in the garden. The evening moved through itself in the easy, automatic way evenings had started to move in this house since she'd arrived. And when it was done and the children were in bed and the kitchen was clean, she sat at the table with her book and did not think about Mrs. Hull's face or the shaking hands on the road out of town. Ethan came through at the usual time, poured his coffee, stood at the window, then, not looking at her, "I should have gone myself. There was fence to repair. I should have gone anyway." She looked at his back. "I handled it." "I know you did." A pause. "That's not the point." She considered that. Considered what it meant coming from him, the particular texture of it, the way it was neither apology nor explanation, but something more like a man registering that the distribution of burden in this arrangement was not what he intended. "Next time I'll go," he said, "or we'll go together." Nora turned a page in her book that she wasn't reading. "All right," she said. Something in the room settled the way things settle when an acknowledgement has been received and accepted and doesn't need to go any further. He finished his coffee. Set the cup in the basin. "Good night, Miss Whitmore." "Good night, Mr. Calloway." She listened to his boots on the hall floor, and then the quiet. The last week of July brought the thing that cracked the summer open. It started with a knock at the door on a Thursday afternoon, 3 men on horseback. One of them Nora recognized as the man called Dobbins, the auctioneer, looking smaller and sweatier on horseback than he had behind his table. "Mr. Calloway," Dobbins said when Ethan came out. "We're here on behalf of the county debt office." "I paid $80, Ethan said. 3 weeks ago. You signed the receipt yourself." "Yes, sir, and that's not in dispute." There's been a question raised about the terms, about the labor contract. Ethan's face didn't change. What kind of question? Dobbins shifted in the saddle. The two men with him were quiet, looking at everything, except directly at anyone. Mr. Hargreaves has filed a counterclaim. He says the bid process he's alleging procedural irregularity, says the bidding should have been reopened. On what grounds? He says you weren't a registered bidder in the county system. Silence. Ethan stood with his hands at his sides. What does that mean? Lizzie's voice came from behind Nora. Both children had appeared without being noticed, as children do. Nora put her hand back without looking and found Lizzie's shoulder, and Lizzie went quiet. It means Hargreaves wants another auction, the second man said, and had the grace to look uncomfortable about it. Ethan looked at Dobbins for a long moment. The look was not angry. It was something worse than angry, the particular look of a man who has encountered an injustice and is calculating exactly how far his patience is going to extend before it stops. I want to see the ordinance, he said. The specific provision that allows a counterclaim after a completed and receipted transaction. Bring it to me in writing, signed by the county judge, not by Hargreaves, and not by his lawyer. He paused. Or by you. Dobbins blinked. Sir, you're an auctioneer, not a county officer. Bring me paperwork from someone who has actual authority, and I'll read it. Until then, this conversation is done. Dobbins looked at the other two men. Something passed between them. Mr. Hargreaves won't be pleased, he said. I expect he won't, Ethan said. Good afternoon. He turned and went back into the house. Nora stepped back from the door with the children, and he came through and closed the door and stood in the hallway for a moment with his hand flat against the wall and his head down. Then he turned, looked at Nora. They can't actually do it, he said. The bid was clean. I've been in this county 15 years. I know exactly what a registered bidder is, and I am one. He said it quietly for her, not the children. Hargreaves is throwing money at a problem to see if it falls over. Will it work? Nora asked. Not if I get to a lawyer first. He straightened. I'll ride into town tomorrow morning. Nora stood in the hallway and held Lizzie's hand and thought about the platform again and the chalkboard and Hargreaves's gold watch catching the sun. He's not going to stop at this, she said. Ethan looked at her. No, he said. I don't reckon he is. It was the first time they had looked at each other and been fully on the same side of something, not employer and employee, not two strangers navigating a strange arrangement, but two people standing inside the same problem and knowing it equally well. Then we'll deal with the next thing when it comes, she said. He nodded. And then he looked at the twins, and something in his expression shifted, the controlled alarm smoothing out, replacing itself with the deliberate calm he put on for their benefit. Who wants to learn how to braid hair? He said. Sam looked immediately scandalized. I don't want to learn to braid hair. Good thing I was talking to your sister, Ethan said. And Lizzie, who had been pale and still for the last 10 minutes, let out a sound that was almost a laugh, and the hallway breathed again. Nora watched Ethan Calloway manage a moment that could have broken badly, and instead didn't, and she thought, this is a man worth paying attention to. And then, because she was honest with herself, even when it was inconvenient, she thought, you already are. You have been for a while now. She let that thought sit for exactly 1 second. Then she went to start supper because the children were hungry and the ranch needed feeding and there was work to do. And work, as she had learned in 18 years of a life that had never once gone easy, was the one thing she knew how to trust. Ethan rode into Harlow Creek the next morning before the heat had fully committed to the day, and he came back 3 hours later with a lawyer's letter folded in his breast pocket, and an expression that was not quite relief, but was the functional equivalent of a man who has looked at the terrain and knows exactly which path doesn't have a cliff at the end. He found Nora in the kitchen running the twins through their letters at the table, Sam laboriously copying Lizzie already 3 lines ahead and trying not to show it. Ethan dropped the letter on the table in front of Nora without preamble. She read it. It was from a man named Alderman Cross, who practiced law out of the county seat, and who had in very precise and not particularly warm language informed the debt collection office that the sale had been executed in full compliance with the county ordinance, that Ethan Calloway had held a valid bidder registration for 11 years, and that any counterclaim proceeding initiated at the behest of a losing bidder would be contested with considerable enthusiasm. "Hargreaves will drop it," she asked. "Cross thinks so. Hargreaves is smart enough to know when something's going to cost more than it's worth." He sat down at the far end of the table. "He's also told me something else. Hargreaves has been doing this before. Other debt auctions. Other situations." He said the word with a particular flatness that conveyed what he thought of the situations without him having to elaborate. "He finds people who don't have the resources to fight him, and he acquires things." Nora set the letter down. "People," she said, not a question. "Labor contracts, land. He collects leverage." Ethan looked at the letter. "You weren't the first is what I'm saying." She sat with that for a moment. The weight of it, not just her own mourning on the platform, but the shape of a pattern. Other mournings, other platforms, other people, without the particular accident of a quiet man in a canvas vest who happened to be standing at the edge of a crowd with $80 and a look on his face like he'd already worked out the arithmetic. "He's going to find another way to come at this," she said. "Probably." "At you specifically, because you beat him publicly." Ethan looked at her. "You think like a tactician," he said. It was not a compliment or a criticism. It was the tone of a man noting a capability he has found useful. "I grew up poor," she said. "You learn to count moves ahead." He was quiet for a moment. Then to the twins without looking up from the table. "You two heard none of this." "Heard none of what?" Sam said with the practiced innocence of a child who has been listening very carefully. "Good boy." Lizzie looked at Nora. Something passed between them, the same kind of communication Nora had noticed between the twins, except this one was newer still being calibrated, and it landed different. Lizzie was afraid, and she was not going to say so, and she was trusting Nora to know it without her having to say it. Nora reached over and straightened the letters Lizzie had been copying, a small gesture, nothing, just a hand near her hand. Lizzie's shoulders came down half an inch. That was enough for now. 3 days after the lawyer's letter, Hargreaves moved. Not legally this time. It was Mrs. Aldgate who told Nora in the flat and informational way she'd apparently decided was appropriate for their particular relationship. Not friendly exactly, but honest, which Nora had decided was considerably more valuable. "He's been talking," Mrs. Aldgate said when Nora came in for the weekly supplies. "About you and Calloway. Not about the contract. About character. Yours." She met Nora's eyes over the counter. The kind of talk that doesn't leave a mark you can point to. Nora understood immediately. "What's he saying?" "That a decent woman wouldn't stay in an unmarried man's house. That the arrangement is not what it's presented as." Mrs. Aldgate pulled the flour from the shelf with crisp efficiency. "He's saying it in the saloon, and at the feed store, and wherever men stand around talking about other people's business, which in this town is most places." Nora stood at the counter and absorbed this. She thought about Ethan's face when he'd read the lawyer's letter. She thought about what it would cost him his reputation in a town where his cattle needed to sell, where his credit needed to hold, where his children went to school and would go to school for years yet. "How bad is it?" she asked. "Bad enough." Mrs. Aldgate paused. "There are people who know better, and there are people who are going to think what they want regardless. But Hargreaves is... he's planting seeds, Miss Whitmore. He's a patient man." "I know," Nora said quietly. She drove home with the supplies and sat with it for the better part of the afternoon, turning it over, looking at the shape of it from every angle. By the time supper was on the table, she had thought it through to the end. She didn't want to reach. After the children were in bed, she went to Ethan. He was at the table with the accounts again. He looked up when she came in. "Sit down," she said. "I need to tell you something." He sat up straighter. She sat across from him and said it plain what Mrs. Aldgate had told her, the rumors, the shape of Hargreaves's campaign, and the conclusion she had arrived at. "I should leave," she said. "Not because I want to, but because staying is going to cost you more than I can repay. Your name in this town, your—" "No," Ethan said. She kept going. "If people believe what he's saying, your credit—" "No." "Ethan." It was the first time she had used his name without the mister. She heard it as it left and did not take it back. "Listen to what I'm telling you. He is going to pull this thread until—" "I heard you," he said. His voice was level and very firm. "And my answer is no. I'm not sending you back to nothing because Hargreaves is a coward who fights with other people's reputations because he hasn't got one worth protecting himself." He leaned forward. "You are here under a legal contract. You are doing exactly what that contract describes. Anyone who wants to say otherwise is welcome to say it to my face and deal with the consequences." She looked at him. He was not performing anger. He was not performing nobility. He was a man sitting at his own kitchen table at 10 o'clock at night telling her a simple fact and meaning every word of it. "This could get worse," she said. "I know." "You'd keep me here anyway." "I'd keep you here because it's the right thing," he said. "And because—" He stopped. Something moved through his face that she hadn't seen before, not the controlled, managed expression of the man who managed everything, but something underneath it. Something that had been there for a while, she thought, and had been kept very carefully below the surface. "Because the children need you. Because this house needs you. Because I—" He stopped there. The kitchen was very quiet. "Because you what?" she asked. Her voice came out careful, steady. She was good at steady when the ground was moving under her. He looked at his hands. "Because you were right," he said finally. "You think 3 moves ahead, and you are almost always right, and I would be a fool to send away the only person in this county who is helping me run this place with any sense." He looked up. "Is that enough reason?" It wasn't quite the sentence he'd started. They both knew it, but neither of them said so. "All right," she said, quietly. "All right." She went to bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about the word because and where it had been going before it stopped. The next morning, Ethan drove into town and paid a call on every man whose opinion mattered in Harlow Creek: the banker, the feed store owner, the postmaster, the county land office clerk. He did not make speeches. He simply appeared in front of each of them, shook their hands, and told them plainly that Miss Whitmore was his housekeeper, that she was doing an excellent job, that the arrangement was legal and proper, and on record with the county, and that he had found the recent rumors to be not only false, but strategically sourced, which was a problem he intended to address. He was back by noon. He didn't tell Nora what he'd done. She heard it from Sam, who had heard it from a boy in town whose father worked at the feed store, who said that Mr. Calloway had come in that morning looking like a man who was not interested in having a conversation, but was prepared to have one anyway. She was at the garden when Sam relayed this, pulling weeds in the early heat with Lizzie beside her doing the same. She didn't say anything for a moment. "Miss Nora," Lizzie said, "your face is doing something. Is it—" She pulled another weed. "What's it doing?" Lizzie studied her. "I don't know," she said. "Something new." Nora sat back on her heels and looked at the garden. "Your father is a good man," she said. "I know," Lizzie said in the tone of someone reporting established fact. "Does he know you think so?" A pause. "He should." "People should know a lot of things," Nora said. "Doesn't mean they do. Tell him sometime." She looked at Lizzie. "He needs to hear it more than he'd ever ask to." Lizzie was quiet for a moment, working a root free with focused concentration. "Do you like him?" she asked with the oblique precision of a child going at a large question through a small door. Nora kept working. "That's a complicated question." "Is it?" "Respect is simple. I respect your father. He's honest, and he's fair, and he showed up at an auction in July and paid $80 for a person he didn't know because it was the right thing to do." She paused. "Like is more complicated. Like means something different." "Does it mean you want to stay?" Nora looked at the girl beside her. 6 years old hair in the braid Nora had taught her. dirt on her knees, eyes sharp and patient, and waiting with the specific patience of someone who has learned to wait because the thing they want takes time to arrive. "Yes," she said. "I think it means something like that." Lizzie nodded, went back to weeding, didn't say anything else, but the set of her face had changed, satisfied in the way children are satisfied when the world resolves into something that matches what they wanted it to be. August came in like a door slamming open. The heat that July had been building toward arrived in the first week of August with the kind of force that stops being weather and starts being a condition you live inside. The cattle needed moving to the north pasture where the water was. The well needed checking twice a day. The garden, which Nora and Lizzie had brought to a reasonable productivity, required constant management against the pressure of the sun. And on the 9th of August at 3 in the afternoon on a Wednesday, the storm came. It didn't announce itself the way summer storms usually did, building through the day, clouds stacking on the western horizon, giving the land time to brace. This one came fast off the north sky, going green-gray in less than an hour, and the wind that arrived ahead of it had a hard specific quality that Nora recognized the moment she stepped outside and felt it cross her face. She went to the barn door. "Mr. Calloway!" Ethan came out from behind the far stalls. He read her face, and then the sky, and his own face, made an immediate decision. "Children. In the house. I need to get them to the root cellar. Go. I've got to get the horses in. There are 2 still in the south pen." He was already moving. "Nora." She stopped. "Get them underground. Don't wait for me." She ran. The twins were in the kitchen when she came through the door, and they looked at her face, and Sam stood up so fast his chair scraped back, and Lizzie closed the book she was reading in one motion. Children who have lived on a ranch long enough know the particular quality of an adult moving with true urgency. "Root cellar," Nora said. "Right now. Bring the lamp." Sam grabbed the lamp. Lizzie grabbed the matches. They had clearly talked through emergency procedures at some point, because they moved together without arguing, which was not their natural mode. The cellar door was in the floor of the pantry. Nora had it open in seconds, and she handed both children down and followed, and pulled the door closed over them, and got the interior bolt thrown, just as she heard the first true sound of the wind overhead. Not a gust, but a sustained enormous pressure like the sky had made up its mind. Sam held the lamp. Lizzie held Nora's hand. Neither of them said anything for a moment, and then Sam said, "Papa's still outside." "I know," Nora said. "He had to get the horses." "I know." "Is he knows what he's doing," she said, firmly, calmly. The way you say a thing you are choosing to believe because the alternative is not functional. "He has worked this ranch through storms before. He knows what he's doing." Lizzie's hand was tight in hers. Not panicked. Lizzie didn't do panic, she did contained and compressed, which was in some ways harder to hold. "How long will it last?" she asked. "Can't say. These fast ones are usually shorter." "Usually," Sam said. "Usually," she confirmed. She sat down on the cellar floor and pulled both children in against her sides, and Lizzie came without hesitation, and Sam came a half-second behind, and the 3 of them sat in the lamplight underground while the storm ran the world above them. She told them things. Not stories, real things in a low, steady voice. How storms form. Why the sky goes green. How the horses knew before people did every time, which was why Ethan had gone for them first. She talked not to comfort them with fiction, but to give them information because information she had found was a better antidote to fear than reassurance. You could argue with reassurance. You couldn't argue with how barometric pressure worked. Sam asked 4 questions. Lizzie asked 2, and they were the harder ones. The wind peaked. They could feel it through the earth, a vibration more than a sound. And then, after a long time, that was probably 30 minutes, but felt like considerably more, it began to ease. When it gentled enough that she could hear individual sounds again, rather than one continuous roar, she heard boots on the floor above the cellar door. Then a knock, 3 specific raps, a pattern, and she thought, he has a knock. He thought about this at some point, gave them a signal. The recognition of that hit her somewhere she hadn't expected. She threw the bolt and pushed the door up, and Ethan was crouching over the opening, and both children came up out of the hole fast and ran into him, and he caught them both and held on with the completeness of a man who has been containing himself very hard for the last 30 minutes and is done containing. "You're okay," he said, low into the tops of their heads. "You're okay." "We knew," Lizzie said, muffled against his shoulder. Miss Nora explained everything. Did she? About barometric pressure. He looked up from over the children's heads and found Nora still in the cellar opening, and the look on his face relief, and something that ran deeper than relief, something that had been building across 6 weeks of mornings and evenings and kitchen tables, and a 6-year-old's hand held in the dark underground. That look was not one she was going to forget quickly. "Thank you," he said. She climbed out of the cellar. "The horses, all in. Lost part of the south fence again, but it's wire, it's fixable." He stood, kids still attached to him. "You moved fast. I know what a rotation wind sounds like." He looked at her for a moment, with that same quality she'd noticed the first day, computing, assessing, arriving at conclusions without advertising the process. "You grew up in tornado country. East side of the county. We lost a barn when I was 9. He nodded slowly. Then again, that look, the one she'd been not naming for 6 weeks, sitting openly on his face for exactly one unguarded moment before he arranged it back into something more manageable. "Let's check the house," he said. They checked the house. The damage was minimal. 2 windows on the west side had blown in. A section of porch. Railing was gone. The garden had taken a beating. They catalogued it together. Ethan and Nora moving through each room while the twins followed. And it was ordinary and efficient, and felt for reasons Nora was not examining closely, like something practiced, like people who had done this kind of shared accounting before and would do it again. At the last window, standing in the late afternoon light that came in sideways and gold after a storm, Ethan said quietly, "Clara used to say, a storm cleaned the air." Nora looked at him. He was looking at the window frame, running a hand along the damage, but his attention was somewhere else. "She was right," Nora said. He glanced at her. "You believe that the pressure difference forces an actual change in the air composition?" She paused. "Also, it just feels true." He held her gaze for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "It does." The twins argued at the far end of the hall about whose job it was to sweep up the glass, and the sound of it, the ordinary bickering alive sound of it, filled the house. And Ethan Calloway turned back to the window frame, and Nora went to referee the argument, and neither of them said anything else about it. But something had shifted. Something that had been tilting for weeks had tilted further, and they both felt it, and neither of them had words for it yet. And that was all right, because the house needed fixing, and the children needed supper, and there was still work to do. There was always still work to do. It was 4 days after the storm that Hargreaves played his next card, and this time it was not rumors, and it was not a counterclaim. A man came to the ranch on a Monday morning, not Dobbins this time, not one of the silent men who'd ridden with him. This was someone else. Younger, with the precise and slightly uncomfortable bearing of a man who is doing a job he finds distasteful but is being paid well enough to do it anyway. He introduced himself as Garrett from the County Land Assessment Office. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "I'm here to notify you that a formal assessment of your northern boundary has been requested. There's been a claim filed that your fence line encroaches on county survey land by approximately 40 yards. Ethan stood very still. "Who filed the claim?" Garrett consulted his paper in the way of a man who knows perfectly well what the paper says, but wants to appear to be checking. "A Mr. Hargreaves, on behalf of a land holding company registered out of San Antonio." "A land company?" Ethan's voice was very flat. "Yes, sir." "How much land are we talking about total?" "The claim covers the northern 40 acres of your registered property, sir. The survey, if it supports the claim, would require a boundary adjustment." Nora had come to the door when she heard the wagon. She stood now in the doorframe, listening, watching Ethan's back. She could see from the set of it exactly what this was doing to him. Not the fear, because she didn't think he was afraid, but the cold, deliberate fury of a man watching someone come at his children's inheritance through paperwork. Garrett finished. There was a silence. "I'll need to see the original survey documents," Ethan said. "The county survey from when this land was filed, not the claim documents. The originals." "I can arrange—" "Today," Ethan said. "Can you arrange them today?" Garrett blinked. That's not. Then I'll come to the office this afternoon and request them myself. You can let them know I'm coming." He looked at Garrett steadily. "Is there anything else?" "No, sir." "Then I appreciate your time." He turned before Garrett could respond and walked back to the house, and his expression as he came through the door and closed it quietly, deliberately. The control of a man who is not going to give his anger, the satisfaction of anything loud, was one of the more frightening things Nora had seen, because it wasn't rage and it wasn't despair, and it was very specifically neither. It was a man who has made a decision and is now moving toward it without deviation. "He's going after the land," Nora said. "He's been planning this longer than the auction," Ethan said. He was already at the desk pulling open the lower drawer where he kept his papers. "That land company is registered in San Antonio. That takes months to set up. This isn't he didn't start this because I outbid him at an auction." He spread documents on the desk. The auction was a coincidence. He was already building toward the land. Nora came to stand beside him. She looked at the documents, the original land registration, the survey plat, the boundary descriptions. She had grown up on a farm. She had watched her father lose his land piece by piece to men who understood paperwork better than he did. She understood intimately exactly how this kind of theft worked. "The Northern 40, she said. "Is that water access?" He looked at her. "Yes." "Creek boundary. The survey line runs along it. Then it's not the land he wants. It's the water rights. If he cuts you off from the Northern Creek access in August, I can't move the cattle through summer without it." He said it quietly. He knows the ranch. He's done his homework. The realization landed between them with the weight of something that had been coming for a while and had finally arrived. This was not a man throwing problems at the situation to see what stuck. This was a man with a plan that had been in motion before Nora had ever stood on a platform, and the auction had been possibly a test of Ethan's character, to see if he was the kind of man who would act, who would fight, who had something worth fighting for. And Ethan had answered that question very clearly in front of 30 witnesses. "He's trying to ruin you," Nora said. "He's trying to ruin me specifically because I got in his way." Ethan looked at her. Which means I got you into this," she said. "No." Fast, clear, no hesitation. "You did not get me into this. He got me into this when he decided to run his operations in my county and then had the poor judgment to try to buy a human being in front of me." He looked back at the documents. "This would have been my problem eventually, regardless." She looked at the side of his face. He believed that. She could hear it. She was not sure it was entirely true, but she could hear that he believed it and that he had decided to believe it, which was its own kind of truth. "What do you need?" she said. He looked up. "From me," she said. "What do you need from me while you fight this?" He held her gaze for a moment, not calculating, not managing, just looking at her. Something in him had stopped performing and was just there in the same room, unguarded. "What you've been doing," he said. "Keep the house. Keep the children steady. Keep—" He stopped, corrected slightly. "Keep doing what you're doing." "That's all?" "That's everything," he said quietly. She held his gaze one moment more. Then she nodded and went back to the kitchen, and by the time Sam came in asking about lunch, she had herself arranged and her hands occupied, and the thing sitting in her chest warm. Specific, entirely inconvenient. She pressed down and kept there, because this was not the time, and because even if it was the time, she was not entirely sure she knew how to say it, and because there were biscuits to make and children to feed, and a man who was about to go to war over 40 acres of water rights and needed her to hold the line at home. She held the line. She was very good at that.
No,
Ethan came back from the county office that afternoon with the original survey documents and a name Nora had not heard before, a name that changed the shape of everything. He came through the door and set the papers on the table and looked at her. The survey, he said, was filed in 1861. The boundary line has never been disputed. Then the claim. The claim is based on a resurvey that was commissioned privately by the land company. He paused. The surveyor they used is a man named Briggs. She waited. Briggs, he said, is Dobbin's brother-in-law. The kitchen went very quiet. Nora sat down. Not from shock from the particular need to be sitting when you encounter something that is simultaneously surprising and not surprising at all, because you had been counting moves ahead and had not seen this specific move, but had seen the shape of the space where it would fit. He owns the auctioneer, she said. And the surveyor. He built the whole mechanism. For how long, I don't know. Ethan sat across from her. But long enough. She looked at the papers between them, thought about her father's signature on a paper he'd signed while drinking, thought about the debt and Dobbin's voice reading her measurements like livestock and the fat man's gold watch. How many other people, she said slowly, has he done this to? Ethan looked at her. His expression was very still. That, he said, is the right question. She looked up from the papers. And, he said quietly, I think we need to find the answer. The right question, as it turned out, had more answers than either of them had prepared for. Ethan started quietly. That was his way, not loud, not announced, just methodical. He began talking to people he trusted, which in Harlow Creek was a shorter list than it should have been, but long enough to work with. The banker, a man named Fellows, who had known Ethan since he first filed on the land. The postmaster who saw everything that moved through a town and remembered most of it. Old Cal Whitten, who had ranched in the county for 40 years and had the particular memory of a man who never wrote anything down because he never needed to. What came back piece by piece over the following week was a picture that was ugly in the specific way that patient cruelty is ugly, not dramatic, not violent, but systemic. Hargreaves had been operating in the county for 6 years. In that time, 4 families had lost land through boundary disputes that all traced back to surveys conducted by a man named Briggs. 2 debt auctions in the past 3 years had ended with labor contracts going to shell companies that dissolved within months, leaving the contracted workers in legal limbo with no recourse. And a land holding registered to a company out of San Antonio, the same company now claiming Ethan's Northern 40 held pieces of 7 different properties, all acquired through processes that were technically legal and functionally predatory. Ethan laid it out for Nora on a Thursday night after the children were in bed, spreading papers across the kitchen table the way you spread a map when you are trying to understand the full territory of something. She read through it without speaking. He let her read. 7 families, she said finally, that we've found. She looked up. There are more. Probably. She looked back at the papers. Her finger tracked down the list of names she mostly didn't know. Families from the outer county. Smaller operations people without connections to lawyers or bankers. People who had signed things and lost things and had no language for what had happened to them, because what had happened was wrapped in legal procedure and official stamps. My father, she said slowly. His debt. The men who held it. Ethan was very still. I don't know if Hargreaves was behind it directly, she said, but the structure is the same, the shape of it. She set the paper down. Someone bought his debt from the original lenders. I remember in the weeks before the auction there was a transfer. A new name on the paperwork. I didn't know who it was. What was the name? She thought back. She had been 17, and she had been trying to understand documents that adults had spent years learning to navigate, and she had been doing it alone in the house after her father left, and she had been frightened, and she had pushed the fear into the place where she kept things she couldn't afford to feel yet. It started with an H, she said, and then as it came Holdings, something Holdings. Ethan looked at her. His face was doing the thing it did when he had arrived at a conclusion that made him very angry and was choosing to process that anger privately before he spoke. Southwest Holdings, he said quietly. That's on the list. The kitchen went still. He bought my father's debt, Nora said. It wasn't a question, but she needed to say it as a sentence, as a fact she could hold in her hands and examine. He manufactured the auction. He needed a way into this county, into this side of it. Your father's land was adjacent to yours, she said. She could see it now, the whole map of it laid out clean. If he'd gotten me into a contract under his shell company and then pursued the boundary claim on your northern 40, he'd have water access on 2 sides. And I'd have no way to run the cattle through summer without negotiating with him. She sat back. The weight of it was not grief exactly. She had processed her father's failures a long time ago, and was not going to perform fresh devastation now. But it was something. The particular sick recognition of understanding that what you had thought was your specific misfortune was actually someone's deliberate architecture, that your worst day had been someone else's calculated step. He was going to use me, she said. Even after the auction, the contract under his company, I would have been leverage, something he could threaten Ethan with. Or threaten you with to get to me. Ethan's voice was flat and very quiet. Either way, you were the instrument. She looked at him. He was looking at the papers with an expression she recognized now, the controlled interior fury she'd seen on his face the morning of the counterclaim, the morning of the assessor. Every morning, Hargreaves found a new way to push. But there was something else underneath it tonight, something more personal, something that had to do with her specifically, and not just with the ranch. This doesn't change anything, she said. About the current situation, about what you're fighting. It changes what I'm fighting for, he said. She looked at him. He looked back. And this time he didn't arrange his expression into something more manageable. He let it stay where it was open, unguarded, carrying exactly what it was carrying. It was always about the ranch, he said. The land and the water and the children's future. That was the whole of it. A pause. It isn't the whole of it anymore. She held his gaze. Her heart was doing something that she was aware of and chose not to analyze. Ethan, she said. I know, he said. I know what the contract says, and I know what my position is. And I know you didn't come here for anything other than what was on that paper. I'm not asking for... He stopped, started over. I'm just telling you the truth. Because you're the kind of person who deserves the truth told to her straight. The lamp between them burned. Outside, the August night was thick and warm and full of the sound of late summer insects, the distant cattle, the slow breath of the land. I know what you're telling me, she said finally, carefully. And I need you to know that I hear it. She folded her hands on the table. But I have 4 months left on that contract, and you have a land war to win. And I think the most honest thing I can say right now is that when this is over, and the terms are settled, and I am standing on the other side of it as a free woman making a free choice, that's when I can tell you what I think, clearly, without the weight of the contract on it. He was quiet for a long moment. That's fair, he said. Is it enough? He looked at her, and the corner of his mouth moved that thing that wasn't quite a smile, but lived in the same territory. It's more than enough, he said. It means there's another side of it. She looked down at the papers, breathed, got herself arranged. Then let's win it, she said. Alderman. Cross the lawyer came to the ranch 2 days later. He was a lean, deliberate man in his 50s who listened more than he spoke and took notes in a hand so small Nora could barely read it across the table. He read through everything Ethan had gathered, all the names, the survey documents, the shell company registrations, the pattern of acquisitions, and he did not speak for a long time after he finished. This is enough, he said, to file a formal complaint with the state land office. Possibly enough for a criminal referral depending on the surveyor's role. Briggs, Ethan said. Dobbins' brother-in-law. If Briggs falsified survey results under contract, that's fraud. That's not a civil matter. Cross looked at his notes. The question is whether the other families will come forward. They will, Nora said. Both men looked at her. They've been waiting for someone to go first, she said. That's how it always works. Nobody wants to be the first person to say the thing because saying it alone costs everything. But if there's already a case, if there's already someone standing in front of it, she looked at Cross. Will it help other witnesses? It would transform it, he said. She looked at Ethan. He was already thinking the same thing. She could see it. I'll go, she said. Nora, I know these families better than you do. She said it plainly, not to wound, but because it was true. I grew up in this county. I know what it costs for people out here to walk into a lawyer's office. I know how to talk to them. She paused. And I have a specific interest in this outcome. Ethan looked at her for a moment. You don't have to do it. I know I don't have to. She held his gaze. I want to. Cross looked between them with the expression of a man who has walked into a room containing something he recognizes but was not told to expect. He made a small note and said nothing. She went to 4 families in the following week. She took the wagon alone. Ethan offered to come, and she told him he was needed at the ranch, which was true, and also that she worked better without the weight of someone else's anger in the room, which was also true, and also that some of these conversations were going to go better woman to woman, which he accepted without argument. The first family, the Pritchards, lived 12 miles east. She found the wife at home, a woman in her 40s named Ruth, with work-hardened hands, and the particular wariness of someone who has been burned by official processes and is not interested in the fire again. Ruth Pritchard listened to Nora on the porch for 10 minutes without interrupting. Then she said, "They'll say we made it up." "They'll try," Nora said. "They won't succeed if there are enough of us." "What do you get out of this?" "I was sold at auction 3 months ago," Nora said. "To settle a debt that Hargreaves bought from my father's original creditors. I was supposed to end up under one of his shell contracts. It didn't work out the way he planned." She looked at Ruth directly. "He took something from your family. He tried to take something from mine. I'd like to make that more difficult for him going forward." Ruth Pritchard looked at her for a long time. "I'd need to talk to my husband." "Of course. I'll come back Friday." On Friday, Ruth Pritchard had a written account of the survey dispute, signed by herself and her husband, ready and waiting. She handed it to Nora at the door and said, "There's a woman named Edna Marsh 2 miles south of us. Her husband lost a water easement 18 months ago. Same situation. She's been trying to talk to someone who'd listen." Nora visited Edna Marsh that same afternoon. Edna Marsh talked for 45 minutes without stopping, and by the end, she was crying not with grief, but with the specific relief of someone who has been holding a story for a very long time and has finally handed it to someone with somewhere to put it. "I thought we were stupid," Edna said. "I thought we'd just missed something, done something wrong." "You didn't do anything wrong," Nora said. "He built a machine. You walked into it. That's not ignorance, that's the point. He made it look like a road when it was a trap." Edna gripped her hands across the table. "You tell that to the judge." "We will," Nora said. "You have my word on it." By the end of the week, she had signed statements from 3 families and a verbal commitment from a 4th. Cross, when Ethan brought the materials to him, went through them with increasing attention and then set them down and said, "This is a case." "Will it hold?" Ethan asked. "If you can get me Briggs," Cross said. "The surveyor. If he falsified those documents, he knows it. These cases don't fall apart on the victim's testimony. They fall apart when the mechanism can't be proven. Briggs is the mechanism." He looked at Ethan. Someone needs to talk to him. Someone who's not a lawyer and not a party to the primary complaint. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "I'll go," he said. "He won't talk to you," Nora said from across the table. "He knows who you are. You're the opposition." She paused. "But he might talk to a woman who seems to be there about a separate matter. Someone who presents as tangential." Cross looked at her. "That's a significant ask, Miss Whitmore." "I know what it is," she said. Ethan said, "Nora, Briggs isn't. We don't know what he is if he's cornered. He's a small man doing a large man's work," she said. "I know that type. He's not dangerous. He's guilty." She looked at Ethan. Guilty men in small positions are the easiest to talk to. They've been waiting for someone to find them out because the waiting is the worst part. Ethan looked at her for a long time. She could see the conflict in him, the practical man who could see that she was right. And the other man, the one who had gone into a lawyer's office 3 months ago on behalf of a girl on a platform who did not like the idea of her walking toward something uncertain. "I'll be fine," she said quietly. "You keep saying that." "Because it keeps being true." He looked at her and something crossed his face that was neither argument nor agreement, but simply acknowledgement, the recognition of a person seeing another person clearly and accepting what they see. "Be back before dark," he said. Briggs had a small office attached to his house on the east edge of town. She found him in as she'd expected, a small man in his 50s with ink-stained fingers and the jumpy quality of someone who has been waiting for a knock at the door for a long time and cannot decide whether each knock is the one he's been dreading. She told him she was there about a property line on her late mother's land. Purely informal, she said. Just trying to understand the survey process. He was nervous from the first sentence. Not of her, of what she might represent, of what the question might open. She kept her voice mild, and her question simple, and she watched him relax incrementally, the way a man relaxes when he thinks the danger has passed. And then, when he was relaxed enough, she set the survey documents on his desk. The ones from the Pritchard claim. The ones from Ethan's northern boundary. She watched his face. The color that left it was answer enough. "Mr. Briggs," she said very quietly, "I'm not here to threaten you. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not an officer. I'm a woman who was sold at auction in this town 3 months ago because of a system that someone built very carefully over a long time. And the person who built it is going to come apart because there are lawyers, and there are witnesses, and there's enough documentation to fill a court docket." She looked at him steadily. "The question is whether you're inside that system or outside it when it falls." His hands were flat on the desk. He was looking at the survey documents. "I didn't know," he said. Then more honestly, "I didn't ask." "I know," she said. "That's different from knowing. Courts know the difference too." He was quiet for a long moment. Dobbin said it was routine. Boundary clarifications. He said, "How many?" she said. He looked up. "How many surveys? For Hargreaves, or for the company?" He looked at the desk. He was counting. She could see him counting, and the count was taking longer than she'd expected. 11, he said finally. The room was very still. "I need you to write them down," she said. "All 11. The properties, the dates, the instructions you were given. Everything you remember." She slid a blank sheet of paper across the desk. "I'll wait." He looked at the paper. He looked at her. He was terrified she could see it clearly, the particular terror of a man standing at the edge of a consequence and understanding for the first time that the only direction with any light in it is forward. "Will it if I cooperate?" "I can't make you promises," she said. "That's not my authority. What I can tell you is that the man who is the center of this is not going to protect you. He never was. You were always expendable." She paused. "The people working against him, though, we keep our word." Briggs picked up his pen. He wrote for 40 minutes. She was back before dark. She came through the door with Briggs's 11-page handwritten account folded in her bag, and Ethan was in the kitchen with the twins at supper, and he looked up when she came in, and the question on his face was one she answered by setting the folded papers on the table in front of him. He looked at her. 11, she said. He opened the papers, read the first page, stopped. "Lord," he said quietly. "Yes." Lizzie looked between them with the concentrated attention of a child who knows something significant is happening and is determined to understand it. "Did you win?" she asked. Nora sat down at the table, picked up a biscuit, looked at Lizzie. "Not yet," she said. "But we know how." Sam, who had been watching her since she came in the door with the particular intensity he reserved for things he was trying to work out, said, "You were scared, weren't you?" When you went. She looked at him. He was 6 years old, and he saw things. Yes, she said. A little. But you went anyway. That's usually how it works, she said. The going anyway is the whole point. Sam nodded slowly with the weight of someone filing this away in a permanent place. Ethan was still reading. When he looked up, his face had gone through several things and settled into something she hadn't seen before. Not the controlled fury, not the managed steadiness, not the grief that lived underneath everything. Something cleaner. Something that looked almost like the beginning of relief. Cross needs these tonight, he said. Then ride tonight. He looked at her for a moment. The kind of moment that holds more than it shows, that is the entire conversation compressed into the space of two people looking at each other across a kitchen table with two children between them and a lamp burning low. Come with me, he said. She looked at the children. We'll bring them, he said. It's not that late. They can sleep on the ride back. Lizzie was already out of her chair. Sam was reaching for his boots. The decision had been made before it was finished, being offered with the particular momentum of a household that has become without anyone formally announcing it a unit. Nora stood, picked up her bag. All right, she said. Let's go. They rode into Harlow Creek with the children wedged between them on the wagon bench, and Briggs' 11 pages folded in Nora's bag like something live. Something that had been wanting out for a long time, and had finally found its door. Cross answered his door in his shirt sleeves and took one look at Ethan's face and stepped back to let them in without a word. The children sat on the bench in the hallway with the drowsy compliance of children who have accepted that the adults are doing something important, and their job is to stay out of the way. Lizzie kept her eyes open longer than Sam did. She was watching the closed office door with the focused patience of a child who understands that what happens behind it matters. Cross read Briggs' account standing at his desk. He did not sit. He turned pages with a steadiness that was itself a kind of controlled reaction. The deliberate calm of a man who has spent a career not showing what he's thinking until he's finished thinking it. When he reached the last page, he set it down and looked at Ethan. 11 properties, he said. Over 4 years. Yes? And Briggs will testify to this. He's already written it, Nora said. He knows there's no other direction left. Cross looked at her with the expression he'd been giving her since the first meeting, assessing, recalibrating, not entirely sure what category she belonged in, and deciding it didn't matter. The state land office will need to be notified tonight. If Hargreaves gets wind of this before we file, he has resources enough to muddy the water considerably. He was already moving toward his desk. I'll need you both here tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. We'll go to the land office together. We'll be here, Ethan said. They rode home through the August dark with both children asleep. Sam first, then Lizzie, with her head against Nora's arm, her braid from 3 days ago, still mostly intact, which Nora noticed with a small, private satisfaction. Ethan drove with one hand on the reins and the other resting on the seat between them, close but not touching, and they didn't speak much, and the silence was the kind that doesn't need filling. After a while he said, You know what you did today? I asked a guilty man to write things down, she said. You walked into a situation that could have gone sideways 6 different ways, and you stayed level the whole time. He paused. I need you to know I see that. She looked at the dark road ahead. I know you see it. Good. Another pause. I want to make sure you know it's not. I'm not cataloging your usefulness. That's not what this is. I know that too, she said. The wagon moved through the dark. The land was enormous and quiet, and the sky above it was the particular density of a clear August night, this far from any town, more stars than dark between them, the whole weight of the universe going about its business overhead, with complete indifference to the specific human drama being worked out below. After tomorrow, she said. What does it look like? Cross files the complaint. The state opens an investigation. Hargreaves can fight it, but he can't make 11 properties and 11 surveys and 6 family testimonies disappear. He was quiet for a moment. The land claim against the Northern 40 gets suspended pending the investigation. could take months to fully resolve, but the immediate threat will be neutralized, she finished. Yes, she sat with that. The specific texture of it, not celebration, not relief exactly, but the particular solid feeling of a thing that has been suspended and unresolved for a long time, finally beginning to find its ground. And the families, she said. The ones who lost land. Cross thinks 3 of the cases have grounds for recovery. The other properties are more complicated. Some of the transfers. He shook his head. It won't all come back, but some of it will. Some is better than none, she said. Yes. He glanced at her. Ruth Pritchard's going to get her eastern pasture back. Cross is almost certain. Nora thought about Ruth Pritchard on that porch. The wariness in her hands, the way she'd said, "They'll say we made it up," with the specific tiredness of a woman who has been told that before. She thought about Edna Marsh crying with relief at her kitchen table. She thought about Briggs writing for 40 minutes with ink-stained fingers, and the particular release of a man setting something down he'd been carrying wrong. Good, she said quietly. That's good. Lizzie shifted against her arm in sleep, small and warm, and entirely trusting, and Nora held very still so she wouldn't wake. The morning came fast. She had the children fed and the house set before 6, and they rode back into Harlow Creek with the early light, flat and gold across the scrubland. And they walked into Cross's office at 2 minutes before 8, and they walked out 2 hours later, having filed a formal complaint with the State Land Office, a criminal referral regarding survey fraud, and a counter-complaint to Hargreaves's boundary claim that Cross described with professional understatement as comprehensive. On the steps outside, Ethan shook Cross's hand, and Cross held it a moment and said, "She's the reason this works, you know. The Briggs document is the spine of it." Ethan glanced at Nora. "I know," he said, simply and completely. She looked at the street. Harlow Creek in the early morning. The mercantile opening its shutters, the feed store taking a delivery ordinary and unchanged. Except that somewhere in the county land office, there was now a filing with 11 properties and 11 surveys, and the careful handwriting of a guilty man who had finally run out of road. Mrs. Aldgate was unlocking her door across the street. She looked over and saw Nora. A pause. Then she lifted her chin in something that was not quite a nod, but was not a nod either. Nora lifted hers in return. "Come on," she said to the twins. "Let's get you home." The news moved through Harlow Creek the way news always moved in a small county, faster than anyone could track, and slower than the truth, with considerable embellishment added in transit. By the end of the week, people knew that Calloway had filed against Hargreaves, that there was a state investigation, that Briggs the surveyor had provided a written statement, and that somehow a young woman from the Whitmore family, the one who'd been at the auction in July, the one working out at the Calloway ranch, had been involved in acquiring it. The thing that surprised Nora was not the speed of it, but the texture of the reaction. She had expected more of what she'd gotten at the water trough in July. The sideways looks, the performative disapproval. What she got instead was more complicated, and, in its way, more honest. People stopped her on the street when she came for supplies, not to gossip, to talk. Ruth Pritchard's sister came by the ranch with a pie and stayed 2 hours. A man she didn't know who had lost a water easement 4 years prior and had not known it was connected to anything larger sat across from her at the mercantile counter and said with the careful words of someone choosing them precisely, "I didn't know you could fight something like that. I thought it was just how it went." "It's how it went for a long time," she said. "Doesn't mean it's how it has to go." He looked at her. "You were at that auction." "Yes." "And you still did all this." "I did it partly because of the auction," she said. "Knowing how it worked from the inside is different from knowing it from the outside." He nodded slowly. "What happened with your father's land?" he asked. "Is that gone?" she said. "That land's been sold twice since. There's no recovery there." She kept her voice level. "But the debt that drove the auction cross is looking at whether it was legally structured. If Hargreaves manufactured it, There may be a fraud claim." The man across the counter looked at her for a long moment. "You're not what I expected," he said. Not unkindly. Just honestly, the way people are honest when something has surprised them past their ability to manage it into politeness. "What did you expect?" she asked. He thought about it. "I don't know," he said. "Less?" She smiled just a little. "Most people do," she said. Chat. Hargreaves left the county on a Thursday in the third week of August. He didn't announce it. He simply wasn't there. One morning, the house he'd kept on the north side of town was locked, and his people were gone, and the office he'd operated through the shell company was cleared out. Cross said it was not flight in the legal sense because the investigation was still preliminary, and there was no order restraining his movement. But it was flight in the moral sense, the departure of a man who has looked at the terrain and found it no longer favorable. Dobbins remained. He had a business and a house and no obvious connection to the fraud beyond his brother-in-law's involvement, and he walked around town for a week with the expression of a man waiting for a ceiling to fall and being perpetually surprised that it hadn't yet. On a Saturday morning, he appeared at the ranch. Nora opened the door, and he stood on the porch looking considerably smaller than he had behind his auctioneer's table hat in both hands. "Miss Whitmore," he said, I want to say something." "Then say it," she said. He looked at his hat. "I read the names on that platform. I set the price. He stopped. "I told myself I was just the mechanism, just the process." He looked up. "I know that's not an excuse." She looked at him for a moment. He was not a bad man, she thought. He was a man who had let himself be used because it was easier than being inconvenient, which was a particular kind of failure she understood better than she wished she did. "No," she said. "It's not an excuse. But it's a reason, and reasons and excuses aren't the same thing." He blinked. "What are you going to do with the business?" she asked. I thought I might the auction house. I thought I might change how it's run, what it handles." He was stumbling, uncertain. "I haven't worked out the details." "Work them out," she said, "and then do them." She held his gaze. "That's all anyone can do. Decide what kind of mechanism to be going forward." He nodded several times and put his hat back on and left. She watched him go and stood in the doorway for a moment, and Lizzie appeared at her elbow. "Who was that?" Lizzie said. "Someone trying to figure out how to do better," Nora said. "Is he going to—" "I don't know," she said honestly. "But he's asking the question. That's usually how it starts." September came in cooler than August had been, which was not a high bar, and the ranch moved into the rhythms of the turning season, the cattle rotation, the garden harvest, the particular shift in light that meant the worst of the heat was behind them. Sam's wrist had healed completely, and he had developed in the weeks of wearing the sling an intense personal interest in how joints worked, which Nora had fed with every piece of practical anatomy she knew, which was more than most people expected. Lizzie had mastered the three-strand adding braid, and had moved on to demanding that Nora teach her a fourth style, which Nora did on Sunday evenings with the lamp turned up high. The contract had 4 months remaining. Nora was aware of this, the way you are aware of a sound at the edge of hearing, not constantly, not loudly, but always there if she turned toward it. 4 months. 3.5. The legal document that defined her presence in this house, this kitchen, this particular life, was running out, and what was on the other side of it was a question she had agreed to wait to answer until the contract's weight was off it. The weight was lifting. She could feel it. And as it lifted, the question underneath it was getting louder. It was a Wednesday evening when Ethan brought it into the open. The children were in bed. She was at the table. He came in, poured coffee, and instead of going to the window or to the desk or to any of the places his restlessness usually took him, he sat directly across from her and put both hands around his cup and looked at her. "The investigation is proceeding," he said. "Cross says the land claim will be formally dropped within the month. The survey fraud referral is with the state attorney." He paused. "It's mostly over." "Mostly," she said. Functionally. He held her gaze. The immediate threat is resolved. She waited. Which means, he said, we're approaching the other side of it. She set her book down. She had been reading the same page for the last hour. Yes, she said. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him working through something the same way she'd watched him work through the survey documents and the land accounts, methodically, honestly not in a hurry, but not delaying either. I want to ask you something, he said. And I want you to know before I ask it, that the answer doesn't change anything about this house, or these children, or it doesn't change what's owed to you. The contract terms stand regardless. I'm not asking with any, Ethan? She said quietly. He stopped. Just ask, she said. He looked at her, and then he said very directly in the way he said everything that mattered, when the contract's done, will you stay? The kitchen held them both. The lamp held steady. Outside, the September night was just beginning to cool at the edges. She had thought about this. She had thought about it more carefully than she had thought about almost anything in her life, which had given her considerable practice in careful thinking. She had turned it over in the weeks since he'd told her the truth in this same kitchen, and she had said, "That's when I can tell you clearly," and she had tested it against every honest thing she knew about herself, about this house, about what she wanted her life to be built on. "I want to tell you something first," she said. He waited. "I came here with nothing," she said. "Less than nothing. I came here with debt attached to my name and a canvas bag with everything I owned in it. I did not expect—" She stopped, found the words. "I did not expect this to be what it is. I did not expect these children to be who they are. I did not expect you." She held his gaze. "And I need you to know that my answer is not because I don't have somewhere else to go. I have built something here. Skills and standing and relationships that are mine. I am not staying because I have no choice." "I know that," he said. "That's the only way I'd want you to stay." She looked at him across the table. The man who had stepped out of a crowd in July and changed the arithmetic of her life, not with rescue, not with charity, but with the specific and radical act of treating her like a person whose dignity was worth defending at cost to himself. The man who had sat in this kitchen and told her the truth and let her set the terms. The man whose children had put their hands in hers and slept soundly in the rooms down the hall. "Yes," she said. "I'll stay." Something moved through his face that was not relief. Relief was too small for it, but was the thing that lives on the other side of a long, hard waiting. He exhaled slow and quiet, and the rigid line of his shoulders came down in a way she had not seen before, a complete and genuine release. "There's something else I want to ask," he said. She looked at him. He reached into his vest pocket and set something on the table between them. Small, plain, a ring that had clearly been kept carefully and had some age to it. "This was my mother's," he said. "Not Clara's. My mother's." He looked at it, then at her. "I want you to have it because it's yours to have or to refuse, not because it's not an obligation. It's not a continuation of any contract." She looked at the ring, then at him. "Ethan Calloway," she said. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "Yes," he said, "I am." She looked at him for a long moment, at this man who never said more than he meant, and never meant less than he said, at this kitchen that had been a territory and had become a home, at the two small bedrooms down the hall, where two children slept with the particular piece of children who had finally stopped waiting for the next leaving. "Then yes," she said, "I am." He looked at her, and the thing that crossed his face was so unguarded and so complete that she had to look away for a second, not because it was too much, but because it was exactly enough. And exactly enough had always been the thing she'd had the hardest time accepting. He reached across the table and picked up her hand, turned it over, set the ring in her palm, and closed her fingers around it, warm and deliberate and certain. "You're sure?" he said, not doubting, just honoring her. "I have been counting moves ahead," she said, "since the moment I met you. I have looked at this from every angle I know how to look at something from." She opened her hand and looked at the ring. "This is the move that makes sense." "That's a very practical way to say yes," he said. "I'm a practical woman." "You are," he said. "It's one of about 40 things." He stopped. His mouth moved toward that almost smile. "I wasn't done with the list." She slid the ring on herself because she was the kind of woman who did that, and he didn't try to take it back and do it for her because he was the kind of man who understood that. And they sat at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and the September dark outside and the children sleeping down the hall, and it was ordinary, and it was extraordinary, and it was, she thought, exactly what she had been working toward without knowing she was working toward it. She told the children in the morning. She had thought about how to do it, whether to let Ethan lead it, whether to wait for a particular moment. In the end, she did it at breakfast because breakfast was when they were all together, and it was a normal thing, and she didn't want it to feel like an announcement or a performance. She set the biscuits on the table and sat down and said, "I have something to tell you both." They looked at her immediately. Children always knew when something was being prepared. "Your father asked me to marry him last night," she said. "I said yes." A silence that lasted approximately 1 full second. Then Lizzie let out a sound that was not a word, a high compressed, entirely undignified sound of pure feeling, and launched herself across the table with enough force to nearly upset the biscuits, and Nora caught her and held on. Sam did not move for a moment. He was doing his thinking. She could see it, processing, weighing, computing. Then he slid off his chair and came around the table and wrapped both arms around her from the side. His face pressed against her arm and didn't say anything at all, which was, from Sam, the largest thing possible. She held them both. Ethan stood in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at the three of them, and the look on his face was the last unguarded one, the one she would carry for the rest of her life. Not happiness exactly, not relief, but the specific and irreplaceable expression of a man who has looked at the rubble of a hard year and found standing in it something that will hold. "Papa," Lizzie said, still attached to Nora. "You have to come over here." "I'm right here," he said. "No, I mean here," she said with the imperious precision of someone managing a scene. "With us. All of us." He crossed the kitchen. He sat beside Nora on the bench, and Lizzie climbed from Nora to him and back again in the manner of someone who has a great deal of affection to distribute and is not entirely certain it will all fit. And Sam stayed where he was, pressed against Nora's arm, and said into her sleeve, "We chose you first, you know." She looked down at him. "I know," she said, "before Papa." "I know." He looked up. His eyes were serious and entirely certain. "We knew," he said, "right at the start. We knew you were going to stay." She looked at this 6-year-old boy who saw things and filed them in permanent places, and had known from a crouched conversation in the dirt outside a farmhouse that she was the kind of person who didn't leave when things got hard. "You're smarter than most adults I've met," she said. "I know," he said, and went back to his biscuit with the composure of someone who has received a fact rather than a compliment. Ethan's hand found hers under the table. Quiet, certain, no ceremony to it, just there. She held on. The formal hearing on Hargreaves's operations was held in the county seat in October, and it lasted 3 days, and it ended with the land claim against the Callaway northern boundary permanently dismissed, a criminal indictment against Briggs for survey fraud, and a civil investigation opened into the shell company's acquisition of 7 properties that Cross believed would result in recovery actions for at least 4 of the affected families. Hargreaves himself was located in Dallas. The state investigation had followed him there, and Cross said with professional precision that the man's options were narrowing in ways that money could only partially address. Nora was not at the hearing. She had offered to testify, and Cross had said her account was valuable, but Briggs' written statement was sufficient for the current proceeding. She stayed at the ranch and managed the children and the house and the early October harvest. And when Ethan came home on the 3rd evening with the outcome, she was at the stove with her back to the door, and she heard him come in, and she heard the quality of his step, purposeful, relieved, a man coming home with good news and the full weight of the last 2 months beginning to lift, and she knew before he said a word. He came up behind her and said nothing for a moment. Then, "It's done." She turned. He looked tired in the good way, the way you look when something that has been requiring a great deal of you has finally released its grip. "All of it?" she asked. "Enough of it." He looked at her. "The land is ours. Clean title permanently. The claim is dismissed with prejudice. He can't refile." She let out a breath she had been carrying for 2 months. He reached out and tucked a strand of her hair back from her face, a small gesture, new one he was still learning the permission of, and said, "It's over." "For us," she said. "For us," he agreed. "Cross is still working on the others." "I know. I'll write to Ruth Pritchard tomorrow." He looked at her for a moment with that look, the quiet, certain, unperforming one. "You're going to keep doing this, aren't you?" he said. "The advocacy, the families." She looked back at him. "Is that all right?" "I'm not asking to approve it," he said. "I'm asking because I want to understand what I'm marrying." The corner of his mouth moved. "So I can plan accordingly." She held his gaze. "You're marrying a woman who was sold at auction and found out it was part of a larger machine and decided that machine deserved to be taken apart piece by piece," she said. "Yes, I intend to keep doing that." He nodded, entirely unsurprised. "Thought so," he said. "Still want to plan accordingly." "More than before," he said. They were married on a Saturday in November in the town of Harlow Creek, in the small church on the east side of the square, the same square where a chalkboard had once listed a girl's debt above her head. The minister was a man who asked no questions about the particulars of how they had met, which Nora appreciated. The children stood beside them. Lizzie, in a dress she had been informed was not to be used for any purpose involving frogs, and Sam, with his hair combed to a standard he found personally unreasonable. Mrs. Aldgate was there. Ruth Pritchard was there with her husband. Edna Marsh sat in the third row and cried for the second time in Nora's presence, this time without the weight behind it. Cross stood at the back with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man attending something that represents to him something more than the sum of its particulars. When the minister asked if Ethan Calloway took this woman, Ethan said yes, with the same direct simplicity with which he said everything that mattered. When the minister asked if Nora Whitmore took this man, she said yes in a voice that carried to the back of the room, because she had learned a long time ago that the things worth saying were worth being heard. Lizzie, who had opinions about ceremony, leaned over to Sam and whispered something. Sam whispered back. Nora, who was standing close enough to hear, heard Sam say, "I told you, right at the beginning." And Lizzie said in the grudging tone of someone who does not enjoy being beaten to a conclusion, "You did. You were right." Ethan heard it too. She could tell by the particular effort he made not to smile during the minister's closing words. She made no such effort. She stood in that church in November, in the town that had sold her, and she smiled. Not small, not careful, not managed. And when Ethan took her hand and they walked back out into the sharp fall light together, she carried nothing from that platform but the knowledge of what she was made of. She had always been made of this. It had just taken the worst morning of her life to put her somewhere the rest of the world could see it. And now she was home and she knew it. And she was never going to need a chalkboard above her head to tell her what she was worth again.